Charlie Smith. Jong Benji, Georgia Strait. I'm Charlie Smith, editor of the Georgia Strait, a Vancouver newspaper, and I'm happy to be back for another week on WOW TV. One of the biggest political stories that's happened this month is the appointment of a new finance minister, Joe Oliver. And he replaces Jim Flaherty, who's been the only finance minister for Canada since Stephen Harper became Prime Minister in 2006. Jim Flaherty had an interesting record. One of the early decisions he made, which was quite controversial, was eliminating income trusts. And these were these investment vehicles whereby corporations could convert into income trusts and then pay less tax. And that was quite a significant move. This had developed and Canada was losing a lot of tax revenue, and I think it should stand as one of the more significant decisions, and quite courageous, I would say, that Jim Flaherty made. Another thing that he did was he moved around the amortization period repeatedly as finance minister, and that's the length of time that you can borrow money to buy real estate. So when he first came in, he increased it to 40 years. So if you bought a house, you could borrow and repay over a 40-year period. And some people at the time thought that was too generous because it would enable people to get into the housing market who maybe didn't have a lot of money and a great capacity to repay. But then what happened, we had the 2008 financial meltdown, and to the government's credit, the banks remained strong throughout, whereas in other countries, the United States notably, but also in Europe, there were severe banking crises, but Canada pulled through fine. And then after that, he reduced the amortization period for real estate to 35 years. And that was in part because the housing crisis was at the root of the banking crisis. There were other issues, of course, like high oil prices, but nevertheless, it was the way these mortgages were bundled and repackaged and sold that created a great deal of financial uncertainty, because these bundled mortgages would be rated very highly by the rating agencies, and then they were sold to investors. But in fact, they were kind of like a house of cards, because people couldn't repay their mortgages once the economy slowed down. And in some cases, financial institutions, particularly in the United States, were inviting people into home ownership who really weren't in a position to pay. So basically what happened next was he reduced it to 35 years, and then subsequent to that, Jim Flaherty reduced the amortization period to 30 years. So he put the squeeze on again. And that was designed to kind of prevent a housing bubble from forming, make it more difficult to buy a home. There was some grumbling in the real estate market and among mortgage brokers. But then what Mr. Flaherty did was he reduced it once again to 25 years. And this has caused serious concern in Vancouver in particular, because we have the highest housing prices in Canada. So the finance minister kept putting the squeeze on the borrowing period. Some people are looking at this and wondering what's driving this. And there are arguments that too much of the Canadian economy is invested in real estate, and too much of the national income goes to real estate, and that's problematic because there isn't enough investment capital freed up for more productive uses. This is an argument that's been advanced by an author named Dambisa Moyo, and looking at why the Chinese economy has performed so well in recent years in comparison to North America. Of course, there are many other factors, but the fact that in the Western industrialized world, so much money is going into the real estate sector. And then what happens is the banks are guaranteed that whenever they run into trouble, there have been exceptions like Lehman Brothers, but for the most part, governments will come in and prop them up. So there's no disincentive for the financial institutions to lend money to people to buy homes, even if they can't really afford to pay for them. So Jim Flaherty was addressing this major structural problem in the economy. I don't think it has received as much attention as it deserves. So then when he brought it down to 25 years, this was creating a sense of urgency in the Lower Mainland, because many of the developers, they have problems. They have to do enough pre-sales to get their financing. The banks in Toronto were putting the squeeze on them, and it became more difficult to finance real estate projects. So that's another legacy of Mr. Flaherty. The third one that I think is worth mentioning is the rise of the deficit. that in the 1990s, the Liberal government with Paul Martin as finance minister slayed the deficit, and Canada became, one of the top countries in the world in terms of managing its finances. Right now, our debt to GDP ratio at the federal level is under 40%, which is remarkable in comparison to most countries. But what's happened in recent years with Stephen Harper and Jim Flaherty is the deficit has been increasing, and it's been adding to our national debt. One of the reasons the deficit is increasing is because Jim Flaherty reduced the GST from 7% to 5%, and that was obviously with the support of the Prime Minister. And what that did was it made it more difficult for the government to collect as much revenue through consumption taxes. At the time, many economists were critical of that, but actually when we reached the meltdown of 2008, that freeing up that consumer spending power, one might argue, was a smart move because it pumped more liquidity into the economy at a time when that was necessary. Of course, when the decision was made, there was no understanding that that might happen, but after it happened, it was quite helpful. Jim Flaherty also worked with the finance minister of British Columbia at the time, Colin Hanson, to introduce the HST, the harmonized sales tax, and that was designed to try to stimulate the economy, stimulate investment, and that combined the 7% provincial tax with the 5% federal tax for a 12% consumption tax. And it was a way to enable businesses to pay less tax, consumers to pay more tax, because this tax was added to areas where the GST didn't previously apply. So, the HST, the provincial sales tax, didn't previously apply. So in some cases, people were paying more tax, consumers, and people were looking at it as a $1.9 billion per year tax shift from corporations to consumers, to the public. But what happened was there was a massive backlash, led to the resignation of Premier Gordon Campbell, and then we had a vote because of the work of Bill Vander Zalm in creating an initiative and having an initiative vote, and the public voted it down. So in the 2013 budget, right before the provincial election, the HST was eliminated. We're back to the GST and the provincial sales tax. So that work of Mr. Flaherty has been undone, and there was considerable controversy. So you could say that Jim Flaherty played a role in the actual resignation of Premier Gordon Campbell in British Columbia. Now his successor, Joe Oliver, has been the Natural Resources Minister. He's a little old for a finance minister, 73, but he's very energetic. He's been most in the news recently in connection with the Northern Gateway Pipeline and pipelines in general. He's been a strong supporter of the pipeline projects and been very critical of environmentalists, for which he's been criticized. There's the Keystone XL pipeline that the Conservative government would like to see go to the United States, and that's a Trans-Canada project. There's Enbridge's Northern Gateway pipeline, where Mr. Oliver has been a strong proponent, and that's raised questions about, the fairness of the regulatory process when the minister takes such a strong stand. He was once executive director of the Ontario Securities Commission. He has a lot of experience in dealing with bankers. One of the things I'll be watching for is Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. It doesn't fall under his portfolio, but I have a sense that the Conservatives do not like the government being in the mortgage insurance business. There are other people who have great concerns if the government were to retreat from this and give it to the private sector. So that's something to watch. And the other thing is he will be the finance minister as they go into the next federal election next year, quite likely, unless problems emerge. And Joe Oliver is now the senior minister for Toronto, so he's a major figure in the Conservative government, and I think he'll be getting a lot more media attention as we go forward.